My daughter gave me an ultimatum: either serve my husband's family or leave. Instead, I smiled, zipped up my old suitcase, and walked out without a single word. 3 days later, I was sitting by a dusty diner window, a cup of burnt coffee, and a list of things I had kept for decades, watching my phone buzz with 31 missed calls from the same people who couldn't wait to see me gone. And the funny thing is, I still hadn't told them what I'd done before I left. Back to 1989, I signed the mortgage papers for this house. 32 years, 384 monthly payments. Every single one was made on time. I worked 2 shifts for 6 years straight, taking whatever jobs came my way, fixing HVAC units in the dead of winter, crawling under houses in the summer heat so my kids could go to college without drowning in debt. When my wife passed away, my daughter Emily told me to move in with her family. "It'll be good for you, Dad," she said. "You won't be alone." And for a while, it was good. I cooked Sunday breakfasts, mowed the lawn, fixed the leaky faucets. I even built a wooden fence around the backyard, a vegetable garden, and a little chicken coop so her kids could collect eggs in the morning. But things changed. Slowly at first. A skipped thank you here, a conversation that went quiet when I walked in the room. My seat at the dinner table shifted from the middle to the far corner. One day, I noticed the family photo wall in the living room, and my picture was gone. Maybe I should have seen it coming. Emily arrived at midday with her husband Jason, and a seriousness that felt practiced, like they were reading from a script. They had new ideas about what a comfortable home should be. They spoke with the certitude of people who had read the right pieces and could quote the right experts. They wrapped those opinions in kindness, like packaging. "You could come stay with us for a few months," Emily said. Jason added that it would help them manage the property. What they offered sounded like hospitality, but what they meant quickly translated into, "We want to rearrange the house to fit our life, and you are an item to be managed." A woman with a clipboard had come by a few weeks earlier and asked to update contact information. She left a small slip with a company name I did not know then, Sycamore Services. I signed the paper without thinking much of it, because it seemed small and routine. I mention that now because the smallest paper left on a porch can become an important thread later. The clipboard was a seed I did not notice until its shoot sprouted. Emily circled the subject like someone naming seasons. We were supposed to accept a new domestic schedule. When she said, "We think your routines are a little unpredictable now," the phrase landed like a measuring tape on a roof, checking which beams they needed removed. I stayed polite, because that is what was expected. Underneath, however, I felt a slow and cold realization that my role was shrinking into something ornamental. Then Emily said it plainly. "You will serve my husband and family, or you will leave." The words had the softness of a pillow and the weight of a brick. It was not a debate. It was an instruction wrapped in care. I felt a flash of heat, and then a small smile formed. It was not the smile of surrender. It was a quiet smile of a man who had decided to observe rather than perform. I packed a suitcase with mechanical calm. I chose the navy shirt my wife always liked, and the boots that had lasted winters. I tucked in the harmonica my daughter used to press to her lips at the kitchen table, and a faded photograph of the summer the tomato vines had outgrown their supports. There is a ritual of leaving, and I honored it by taking only what I could explain simply if asked. At the threshold, Emily asked if I was all right. I said, "Yes, I will be fine." I did not raise my voice. I closed the door softly and drove to a motel on the edge of town, because sometimes nowhere offers the clearest view. Leaving quietly can be a strategy when the spectacle is what the other side wants. By morning, 31 missed calls blinked across my phone. The pattern was sharp. Attention when it suited them, silence otherwise. I slept badly with that ultimatum echoing behind my eyelids. I began to take inventory like a man bracing for weather. The radiator that had sighed during cartoons, the pear tree my wife and I planted, the screws I had tightened in the porch swing. These were not dollars on paper. They were memory and belonging. I had been helping with their mortgage for a time, quietly and steadily, because Jason had been between jobs and their household needed cover. I had bank confirmations and printed proofs tucked into a drawer like small private receipts. For them, my help had been generous. For them, it had become an expectation. For me, it had become a rope that tightened. On the third morning, I walked across to Rosa's house. Rosa baked bread for me when Maria was tired, and her gestures are practical and plain. She looked through what I told her and then said, "There was a woman with a clipboard, and she left a slip for Sycamore Services. Gather what you have," she said simply, "and see what happens." Her words were spare. They felt like a match kept in a pocket. That afternoon, I sat in a diner watching rain make pale rivers down the windows. I did not want melodrama or a television revenge plot. I wanted accuracy. I wanted the language that described my place in the house back. Leaving was not an escape. It was a choice. Choice has leverage only when it rests on facts instead of fury. Before I slept, I opened my bank app and I canceled the 2 standing payments I had been sending to what I had believed was a household account. The confirmation read 2 automatic payments canceled. For the first time in years, the line that had carried someone else's name was quiet. My hands were steady, and the motel room felt less like temporary exile and more like a place to gather the evidence of a life. My insomnia after leaving was not insomnia at all. It was a kind of gathering. I sat with papers spread across the motel table as if they were maps. There were bank confirmations that showed the transfers I had made, receipts from a used furniture shop where I had bought a chair for the living room, and a printout of an email from Jason confirming his starting date at a company he never actually worked at for 2 months. Small discrepancies added up, like one loose tile, revealing a hollow floor beneath. I drove back to the neighborhood under a gray sky the next morning. The house looked like a domestic photograph from another life. The mailbox still bore my name, though someone had slipped a glossy flyer inside advertising home staging services. I stood on the sidewalk and ran my hand along the wooden post, as if it were the spine of an old book. Rosa met me at the fence and handed me a loaf wrapped in wax paper, the way she always had. She did not congratulate me or condemn me. She handed me sustenance, and that felt more honest than a speech. I called a lawyer, because sometimes legal language is the best clarity a man can have when his memory is not enough. Todd was a man with a gentle voice who had done pro bono work around town for older folks. He listened to the story and asked precise questions about dates and accounts. He did not use the word betrayal, but he did use words like documentation and title. He suggested I pause certain transfers and consult the title company. His temperance steadied me more than his experience. It is a small grace to be talked to like a grown man about papers, and not just feelings. While the lawyer was practical, my heart wanted immediate symbolism. I went into the house and opened the dresser, where I had kept my small collection of things that had survived shifts in the household. Among them was a key ring with 2 keys and an old brass tag. On the back of the tag, someone, sometime, had written a date and the name of the bank where the original mortgage had been signed. The key was a remnant, and somehow it felt like an argument waiting to be made. Emily called me that afternoon and asked me to reconsider. Her voice had the tightness of someone apologizing while not conceding anything. I felt oddly amused by the posture. She said they had not meant to exclude me, that they had only wanted an easy practical arrangement. I stopped myself from explaining the transfers and the way that transactions make moral claims. I thought about telling her that service is a dignity when chosen, but a humiliation when expected. I did not say any of that. I said, I need some time to think. That night I reviewed the recorded voicemail messages I had collected over months without really noticing their cadence. There were casual texts about renovations, a message from a contractor confirming a granite counter order, and a voicemail from Jason thanking me for covering a late payment. It was not malicious in the sense of deliberation. It was cruel in the sense of entitlement. When I played the messages again, I began to sense the architecture of expectation that had been built around my kindness. 3 days later, there was a development that was both tiny and large. The bank had sent a letter to the house. It was addressed to Emily and Jason with a clear subject line about audit and verification. At first, I supposed Jason had been careless with his paperwork. Then Todd called me at the motel and said, "For what it is worth, there are strings attached to some of those transfers. They were made from your account, but into a business account that is not exactly under their name. There are questions about purpose and routing. That was the first twist I had not expected. The wiring had been routed through an account tied to a services company that had an ambiguous name. Todd said he believed that a portion of the funds had been diverted into purchases that were not strictly household. He asked if I had receipts for the appliance shipments that had appeared in photos online. My stomach turned because the images I had glimpsed showed a life that had been lived in a different currency than the one I thought I paid for. The next morning, I placed 12 packets together, one for people I trusted in the neighborhood. Each packet contained a printout, a photo, and a short note. I did not intend to see the spectacle. I intended that paper speak to memory where words had failed. At the community brunch, curiosity did what paper rarely does. People read, and expressions shifted. I watched hands go to mouths and necks straighten. That is how an account register moves from private to public, by being legible under daylight. The packets had weight. Jason stepped out to take a call and returned pale. He said, "My boss called. There is a vendor review." My packets had begun to ripple into other places. I had not set out to involve an employer, but once paper moves, it finds other desks to land on. That was a consequence I had not sought, and one I would have to accept. Mark arrived at my motel with a quiet steadiness that made me feel oddly unafraid. He had a small leather folder and a way of listening that made interruptions unnecessary. We sat at a diner table with coffee cooling and went through the transfers one by one. There were entries timed to mortgage due dates and others that matched receipts for things I never authorized, like a membership fee at a club, and a payment to a courier I did not recognize. When you see numbers in a row, they acquire a personality the way a row of old houses can appear to have temperaments. After an hour, Mark said, "These are not accidental." He did not shout. He did not moralize. He offered a sequence of practical steps. We would confirm the recipient accounts, cross-reference the contractor receipts, and then check the recorded documents at the county clerk. He explained that the goal was clarity. Clarity makes public truth easier to speak. I felt relief because anger is a noisy companion, and logic is less so. I had spent my life building things that lasted, and I knew the value of a document that I did not forget. We drove to the county recorder, where fluorescent lights and the smell of paper make anything you say feel like a confession. There was a recent transaction I had not been told about. An interest in the property had been transferred into a company with a neutral name and a little paperwork footnote. There was a signature on that line, and as Mark suggested, signatures cast longer shadows than intended. The first twist came in that office when I realized some of the transfers had been routed through a business account and not a household account. It is a small thing to call this a bookkeeping maneuver, and it can be called that in polite conversation. But in practice, it allowed purchases that looked domestic to appear as business expenses. I sat back hard against the vinyl chair and felt something like being walled off from a house I had helped raise. The ledger had created categories that erased my presence. When we left, someone in the clerk's office nodded and said, "I remember the wedding. You had a good suit on." Those small remembrances are a kindness and a sting. That evening I met with Todd, the lawyer, and he explained how to place a temporary hold on outgoing transfers from my own accounts that I controlled. Todd was careful to say this was not about punishment, but about stopping the bleeding while we assessed the architecture of the finances. His calm made me feel steady in the face of what had begun. As we worked, a second twist arrived in the form of public narrative. A local column appeared online that painted me as a man who had abandoned his household obligations during a storm. The photograph used in the column was of me from a community award years ago. Somebody had called the paper with a story trimmed to create a portrait of instability. It sat on the internet like a moth on a porch light. Mark said someone was trying to set the stage. He said we had to be methodical and not lean into anger, too. We gathered more evidence. Neighbors came forward with small things that mattered. Rosa gave me a text message thread where Emily had praised a contractor for updates she wanted, and one of the contractors confirmed deposits that matched the transfers. A woman from the garden club handed over a photograph showing a new piece of furniture in their living room posted on a Sunday with a caption about hosting. The picture was mundane and damning. Where once I had felt generous in the knowledge of my giving, the ledger made that generosity legible in numbers. Mark suggested a public clarity moment rather than a confrontation. Put the facts in the hands of people who had known me for years and let the community decide. It felt like handing a heavy stone to friends and asking them to weigh it. I photographed receipts, printed bank confirmations, and prepared 12 packets addressed to acquaintances who had been with us through trivial and tender times. Each packet had my handwriting on the outside so there could be no question about origin. My hand shook slightly when I wrote my name. On the morning of a planned community brunch, I carried those packets in my coat. I thought of the summer my wife taught Emily to tie tomato vines. I thought of the porch where we had shared quiet nights, and which now felt like a stage for accusation. When guests began to arrive, I slipped 2 packets onto the refreshment table and watched. People are curious by habit. A conversation began and folded into pages. Eyes scanned numbers and photographs. A murmur rose, and then an uneven shuffle of expressions changed the room. Just as the curiosity swelled, Jason stood and tried to redirect the room toward holiday toast and toward kindness. Emily reached for a packet, and her hand was quick. For a second, I imagined a resolution where they admitted a mistake, and everything was restored. That did not happen. Instead, Emily's face hardened, and she walked out of the room. I folded my hands and felt the ledger at the edge of what could be said. I stood by my car and felt the ridiculous intimacy of a scratched window, as if someone had drawn a small line on my life's map. The phone kept buzzing with calls and messages, and the number felt like a drum I did not always want to answer. Rosa came out and put a hand on my shoulder and said, "Keep breathing." And then she gave me a list of 2 neighbors who could testify to what they knew. It was practical and modest, and it anchored me back into a community rather than a courtroom. He had the look of a man steadying a pride that had been chipped away slowly. He admitted that on some occasions a woman had come to the door with quick paperwork. He said he had signed some receipts without checking routing, because asking felt like admitting failure. His confession sounded sincere and human. I asked the question that mattered most: who authorized payments into the services account? He hesitated. He said he had assumed Emily had handled some things, and that he signed a few forms to keep a contractor happy. In that falter was a gap between intention and consequence. He did not mean malice. He meant to preserve a face of normalcy, and it had become a scaffolding for expectation. He stayed, and then, in a moment that surprised me, he offered me a detail that would matter for the bank. He admitted he had a contractor's contact, and that invoices often carried an odd routing note. That small thread would help untangle numbers. He left with a promise to cooperate and to gather receipts. I called Todd and Mark and told them the contractor's name. Todd said, "The bank gave 7 days to submit documentation for flagged payments." That countdown tightened the week ahead into a shape. We pressed forward. After each technical step, I insisted we confront someone. When a contractor said he had been told to bill the services account, he looked embarrassed and human. After a day, a local columnist tried to shape a narrative that painted me as irresponsible, but Mark said someone was trying to preempt the packets. The right move was to keep facts visible and to resist the pull of counter-narrative. At the end of the week, Todd sent me a scanned county page with a circle around an irregular notarization. He wrote, "This is where we begin a legal challenge." The circled mark felt like a hinge. It would be where the story could change. Planning felt less like plotting and more like assembling a machine that would sing when you turned the crank. I met with Todd and Mark in a small kitchen where the light came through curtains the way a truth can. We discussed sequence and audience. Todd cautioned me that exposing people without care risks bitterness and further fracture. Mark smiled and said, "We will let the documents do the speaking. The documents are patient. They do not need to be loud." I liked that image because I have spent a life making sure detail outlasted fury. I arranged for the packets to be placed strategically. I made a short statement to print and left a copy where a neighbor who ran the community blog could find it. I asked Rosa to bring a pie because small acts of normalcy cushion the shock of discovery. I dressed that day in a shirt my wife loved the color of and a jacket that had been mended the summer she was gone. Dressing in a way that felt like me was an act of reconstitution and not performance. The plan had a legal spine and a public face. Todd filed a simple verification request with the bank and asked them to flag any transfers to the business account pending audit. That move bought time, and it bought legitimacy. There are few things more practical than forcing an institution to look at a ledger. While the bank opened an inquiry, Mark met a contractor in a parking lot and asked for copies of receipts. The contractor was hesitant and awkward at first. I could see in his face the calculus of livelihood. The contractor handed over a stack of receipts that were stamped with the business account number and a routing note that matched transfers I had made. There was a thin red line that connected what had been paid to what had been purchased and what was now being shown off in photographs. The contractor muttered that he had been told to send invoices to the company because that was how payment was handled. He did not want to be part of a fight. He wanted to be paid. He looked at me with a small sorrow and then left. At brunch, the room felt like the inside of a clock. People were moving and predictable, and yet time felt suspended. I placed a packet on the table near a woman who taught Sunday school and another by the man who ran the local hardware store. It was not random. These people had watched my family for years. I wanted witnesses who remembered the arc of a life and who could tolerate complexity. I walked slowly around the room and listened to the soft growth of questioning. Just as the whispers began to form and curiosity spread, Jason rose with a nervousness that did not suit him. He said in a tone that pretended to flatter, "There are things more important than receipts, and I think family is one of them." He used a linguistic move that stakes a moral ground so broad that facts can seem narrow. Emily stood and smiled in the way people smile when they want people to forget numbers and remember the perfect roast. For a second, I felt the old habit of wanting to avoid spectacle. As the pages were read, the expression in the room changed. Hands went to mouths, heads tilted, and the air thickened with reappraisal. A man from the garden club pointed to the photograph of a new appliance and asked, "Did you all fund this?" There was that element of wonder. My voice in the pause was small but steady. I explained where the transfers had come from, what I thought they had been named, and how a business account had been used in place of a household ledger. The facts lodged in the room the way a stone sets. That is when a call came in on Jason's phone that made him lose his gait. He stepped outside and returned with a face ashen from a conversation. A minute later, he said, "My boss called. I might be in trouble at work." There was a moment when the choreography of their lives frayed and a different bureaucracy stepped in. It turned out Jason S. employer had been contacted by a vendor about suspicious invoices that matched the payments we were now examining. The third twist was a bit of theater and a great deal of consequence. A vendor at the company where Jason worked had noticed payments routing through a shadow account, and the employer had initiated an internal review. The review was not my making, but it intersected with the ledger I had brought. Suddenly, the problem was broader than our neighborhood, and the consequences could touch livelihoods. People in the room shifted from discomfort to curiosity to calculation. Was this a legal matter or a moral failure? At a community brunch, I set out the packets and watched as neighbors read the invoices and photos. A man from the hardware store remembered me fixing his porch for no pay. That witness mattered. Paper can call memory forward because the human brain sometimes needs a prompt to recall what generosity looks like. The vendor review at Jason's office escalated to a conversation with accounts payable, and the company put Jason on administrative leave pending the investigation. It was not my doing, but it was the reality of consequence when paper touches corporate procedure. I did not cheer. I watched how a life at work could be fragile when it met public scrutiny. In the middle of these days, the thin envelope that had arrived at the motel would not let me rest. Todd suggested we visit the post office to see if the postmark offered a clue. The clerk patiently checked routing marks and found a stamp from a nearby town. Mark sent an image of the handwriting to a contact who did handwriting comparison, a cautious expert who asked to see originals. We arranged for a secure transfer so the analyst could examine the ink under a microscope. It gave us a thread, and also stretched the time we waited. I prepared the packets again, refined the dates, and arranged for careful disclosure rather than theatrics. At the community reading, the murmurs grew, and then quieted into attention. Several people stepped forward to offer small confirmations. I felt the balance shift a fraction, and the ledger we had compiled became less private. That night, a thin envelope slipped under the motel door. The note inside said simply, "We are sorry." The handwriting had a pressure that the analyst would later say bore similarities to another sample. It was not proof. It was a hint. The hint kept me awake. The bank called me and used words in a measured tone that made the grind of procedure feel less personal. They had opened an inquiry and asked me to confirm the dates of transfers and the accounts involved. Todd had already spoken to their compliance officer and provided documentation. The bank asked for time to verify the links between the payments and the recipient accounts. That procedural language is oddly intimate. It means somebody has taken the paper seriously enough to read it. I felt a strange calm, even in the middle of what felt like upheaval. Jason S.'s employer initiated an internal review after a vendor contacted accounts payable about irregular invoices. It was a small company in a field Jason had described to me proudly 3 years earlier. When you work in a place the size of a neighborhood, reputations travel fast, and consequences can land the way a misplaced bolt lands on a floor. The rumor moved through my street with a current that unsettled me. I did not revel in it. I simply watched how someone's life could be affected by bookkeeping in ways that broke trust. Todd called the bank, and the bank opened the audit. I provided copies and asked for the temporary flag that would prevent further routing while the compliance team checked the accounts. The bank's language felt dense and procedural, but procedure, when engaged, has the virtue of moving facts into formal space. We found more invoices with stamps and routing codes matching the services account. We learned from a contractor that a woman had asked for invoices to be sent to a company account for convenience. The contractor, when we spoke to him in a parking lot, looked apologetic. He said he had been told this was how payment was handled. He wanted his work paid, and little else. Meanwhile, the handwriting analyst called back and said the sample had similarities to a few documents we had recovered, but that certainty required direct comparison of ink and paper. Todd arranged to have originals sent for forensic inspection. Each step took time, and each delay increased pressure. The local column continued to shape impressions for some readers, and for a while that fog thinned sympathy. I pressed on because facts, when assembled, have gravity. I insisted on a public clarity meeting, and a neighbor from Human Resources quietly offered to review invoices if we provided documentation. The involvement of an employer widened the perimeter of consequence. At the bank, Todd sat with a compliance officer and asked about reclaiming misrouted payments. The officer referenced a form and a tracing code and said the process could take weeks, but that a flagged transaction with a clear paper trail improves the chance of recovery. The specificity made me feel less at sea. The bank gave a timeline and a reference number that we taped to our folder and watched like a clock. The forensic clerk put my handwriting beside the questioned notarized document, and photographed the two. When she pointed to the final flourish of the name and said, "The R looks different," the moment felt precise and heavy. If that stroke was not my hand, then the notarized record might be vulnerable to legal challenge. The envelope inquiry continued. We took the postmark to the local postmaster, who said he would check delivery records and any cameras that might show who had posted it. The postmaster was polite, and we left with the sense that someone had reached and retreated into caution. The waiting and the checking is an instrument that tightens as it goes. The news spread. Some people sympathized with me. Other people, perhaps embarrassed by the degree of censure the ledger invited, stayed quiet. I found that those who had known my wife noticed how I kept my gestures small and practical. Rosa stopped by with a bag of tomatoes and an old apron she had mended for me years ago. Her presence was a geometrical kindness. She said, "Keep your receipts and your story. People will see." Emily called that evening in a tone that tried to be sisterly and managerial at once. She spoke of stress and of fear about what the bank might do. Her voice had traces of regret and calculation braided together. I listened and said that if she wanted to fix a mistake, the first step was honesty. She did not answer the simple point in the way I hoped. She asked if I would consider a family mediation session. There was a civility to the task that felt like a second layer of negotiation. When the notary paperwork was examined by Todd and a forensics clerk recommended by Mark, an oddity emerged. The signature on the transfer document did not match my usual hand. There were flourishes I do not use, and a pressure of a pen that felt unlike mine. It might be nothing. It might be everything. The third twist suggested that an attempt had been made to normalize a transfer that lacked my active assent. If the signature was not mine in a meaningful legal way, then the recorded change of interest could be overturned. At the end of the day, Todd placed a copy of the questioned notarization in front of me and said simply, "This is the hinge." The chapter closes with the image of the small curl in the signature and the feeling that a slow machine was now turning. The week that followed felt like walking through a neighborhood that was both familiar and rearranged. People I had waved to for decades now paused when they saw me, and sometimes they smiled in a way that suggested conversation and not judgment. Todd called with updates from the bank and the county and encouraged patience. There were forms to fill and statements to sign and a kind of legal hygiene that is tedious and final all at once. I learned to read page numbers like landmarks. Jason's employer placed him on leave pending the result of an internal audit. The suspension was not a spectacle on the front page, but it was the kind of consequence that nudges a person to re-examine their choices. I did not celebrate his misfortune. I paid attention to the fact that small livelihoods can wobble when finance and character collide. At the same time, the vendor records being questioned led to a request for reimbursement from the business account. The bank suggested that some funds could be returned and that invoices might be reconciled. Emily, in the quiet that followed, began to experience the slow unspooling of embarrassment and remorse. She apologized privately at first, and then, after a week of conversations, she drafted a letter to friends and neighbors that read as a request for patience. I read it, and I felt a tautness in my chest, like the last chord of a song I once knew. She had written, "I was wrong to assume that kindness could be taken advantage of, and I am sorry for the pain I caused." That letter did not erase things, but it was a beginning. There were logistical moves, too. Todd advised that because the recorded transfer to the company could be challenged, we should pursue a dual track. challenge the notarization, and ask for a forensic review, while also seeking civil remedy for misapplied funds. The constitutional virtue of procedure felt oddly consoling. It asserted that the state would look at details, and not merely the loudest voice in a kitchen argument. I felt an oddly bureaucratic gratitude for the fact that the process can protect quiet people. At a community meeting where neighbors gathered under folding chairs and a single bright light, I handed out a short note and asked for a moment to speak about transparency. I described the transfers calmly and showed a simple printout of dates and recipients. The audience listened, and the neighbor who ran the hardware store said, "I remember a week when you fixed my porch for nothing." People nodded. The ledger was doing the work of memory. One by one, people stepped forward and expressed discomfort and an inclination toward fairness. The third twist, the one that surprised me because it was not revenge so much as consequence, came when a manager from Jason's company called to say that the audit had located suspicious activity and that the finance department wanted to review accounts that matched the transfers listed in my packets. The company was now participating in an investigation that could affect contracts and payroll. I realized that my little packets had breached a threshold where private matters entered corporate spaces, and the scope of consequence widened. In the days after the company inquiry began, Jason's demeanor changed. He went from practiced bluster to a kind of weary compliance. Emily was raw and asked me if I would meet with them at a mediator's office. I agreed on the condition that the meeting be transparent and recorded, because I wanted facts to be captured the way photographs capture light. We sat in a room with a woman who was patient and stern and who asked us to speak plainly about obligations and expectations. Emily said she had felt pressure from the need to present a certain life. She said she had worried about keeping up with friends and a social standard that felt increasingly expensive. Jason said he had been embarrassed at his inability to secure steady work and had made choices that prioritized image. I listened, and then I spoke about small things, about the way a man can be slowly removed from the center of his life by being thanked less and asked to do more. I did not seek revenge in my words. I sought clarity and a boundary. We agreed on a plan that included restitution where possible, an audit to determine repayments, and a set of boundaries around the house. I also decided on a step that surprised even me. I signed paperwork that placed a portion of the property in a trust for community use, should I not be able to remain. The idea was not impulsive. It was a way to separate my identity from a piece of real estate that had been entangled with the politics of our family life. I wanted the garden and the bench to serve more people than personal grievances. The bank's audit recovered a portion of funds after it found certain payments had been misrouted and miscategorized as business expenses. The recovered monies covered unpaid invoices and some renovations that had been completed. We paid contractors fair amounts for work done. The arithmetic of restoration felt like closing a loop in an old machine. Jason was eventually let go after his employer's review concluded there were irregularities tied to his area. He had tried to act in the midst of pressure. In one clumsy, earnest moment, he walked to a contractor's house and offered a personal check to cover a disputed invoice, and he wrote a letter to his manager explaining the strain they had been under and asking for a chance. These gestures were human, and they were not enough to stop company procedure. The outcome felt brutal in its clarity. Emily and I negotiated restitution and clear boundaries. She wrote a note to neighbors that acknowledged mistakes and requested patience. She also began helping in practical ways around the house. That was not a return to what we had been, but it was a beginning of a new arrangement rather than a reversion to the old. Todd advised that because the recorded interest change might be vulnerable if the notarization proved suspect, we pursue a dual track, a challenge of the formal record and a civil claim for misapplied funds. The bank had given us a reference number and a timeline. We used those dates like rails. I remember a day when Rosa brought preserves and an old key she had found in the shed. It was small and sentimental and meaningless in paperwork terms, but important for me. A neighbor from the garden club handed me a list of children who wanted to learn planting and asked if I would teach them. The invitations were ordinary, but they meant the day was not only about invoices and challenges. Even as things settled into process, I kept a worry in my pocket. Todd mentioned offhand that one payment in the series still lacked a clear recipient, and the routing code did not match the pattern. It was a small loose end, and I could not let it rest. I did not know if it was an error or an intentional concealment, but I knew we had not yet finished the work. That uncertainty lingered like a small counterpoint. Several months later, life had the slow rhythm of weather. Some things resumed the way rivers return to a bed. Jason had been placed on administrative leave and then let go after his employer concluded the review. It was not a satisfied crowd that watched that happen, and I was careful never to frame it as my triumph. People lose jobs and livelihoods, and that is never a spectacle to take pleasure in. What I did attend to was the restoration of my own voice and the dignity of saying what had been done. The bank recovered a portion of the misapplied funds after they found that some transactions had been routed incorrectly and flagged as business expenses. The sums covered unpaid invoices and some of the renovations that had been undertaken. I paid the contractor the fair amount for work actually completed. It felt like closing a circle with honesty. There was financial repair and procedural accounting, but also there was the quiet satisfaction of paperwork matching reality. Emily and Jason moved out of the house a month later. They rented a small apartment across town and told a few close friends they were taking time to reassess priorities. The neighborhood pace changed with their absence. I replaced the wedding photo in its place, not as a reclamation, but as a gentle reminder of the life that had been. She left me the harmonica again, and a note that read, "For when you want to play." I keep it in a drawer, and sometimes in the afternoons I take it out and blow the weakest, most honest notes. Our settlement included a plan for restitution, where appropriate, and a mediation that aimed to rebuild what could be mended. My objective was never to burn a life down. It was to ask for recognition and to ask for accountability. We agreed on boundaries that meant my presence in the house would no longer be conditional, and that decisions about property required a degree of mutual respect. I felt like a man who had been given back the right to speak at the table. There was a small symbolic act I performed that surprised some people and delighted others. Rather than insisting that the house remain solely mine, I donated a portion of the land to a local community trust that would maintain a reading bench and a small orchard. I wanted something practical and communal to emerge from what had been private pain. The bench bore a plaque that read simply, "For gatherings and honest talk." It was not meant to be moralizing. It was meant to be the scaffolding for neighbors to share. People asked me if I felt vengeance. I would say no. There is a distinction between vengeance and the settling of accounts. Vengeance implies malice and spectacle. What I practiced was the ordering of facts and the assertion of boundaries. It felt more like picking up tools and repairing a roof than staging a catastrophe. That image helped me sleep better. I also learned that sometimes the most effective pushback is to resist being shoved away quietly. In private, Emily and I met a few times to parse what had happened. We spoke of pressure and of social display and of the insidious way small entitlements can harden into structures. She told me she had not realized how easily expectations could calcify into demands. I told her that I had not wanted money or control, but the recognition that I had helped build a life. This was a language we had to rebuild. There were apologies and moments of awkward tenderness. There were also long stretches where neither of us knew exactly how to be whole. The final twist came not as a headline, but as a small and persistent kindness. One morning, a woman from the garden club came to my door with a list of children who wanted to learn how to plant tomatoes. She said, "They want to know how you taught Emily." She handed me a small card where the names were written in childish script. I placed the card on the kitchen table and felt like someone handing the harmonica to a new pair of lungs. The act was not a reversal so much as a continuation. As seasons changed, I kept my routine of tending the garden and fixing things that needed fixing. I hosted a simple harvest gathering and invited neighbors, including some of the people who had been the hardest to reach. We ate and we passed around plates, and we did a small reading of the ledger in a way that felt educational rather than accusatory. It was not about shaming. It was about telling a story that had lessons for the people in it. In the quiet moments, I sometimes think about the suitcase I carried the day I left. It contained a shirt and a harmonica and a photograph of tomatoes. It was more than luggage. It was a symbol for the choice to walk away from a pattern that had been turning me smaller. When I play the harmonica now, I do not play to gloat. I play because sound remembers things, and because my life is still a work in progress. The story ends not with a headline, but with a girl handing me a card with names in shaky script. She wanted to learn how to tie a tomato vine and asked if I would teach. I put the harmonica on the table and felt that a small continuation, rather than a reversal, had taken place. If there is a line to draw, it is this. When you are pushed to the edge of a family story, you can scream or you can be precise. I chose precision and the work of repair. The outcome was not neat but enough.